Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the launch of the 2021 annual report of Amnesty International. It's a great honor for me to be launching this report, the second since I started my responsibilities as Secretary General, and the first, in fact, I can actually launch in a non-digital way. It was very important for me to be launching it from Africa for reasons that are going to be made clear as we, as we describe the state of the world in 2021 and what it means for 2022. And I will, begin by saying that maybe it's not so easy to focus on what happened in 2021 when the world attention is so drawn to events in Ukraine. But in many ways, the first few months of 2022 are a direct legacy of what was and what was not done for human rights in 2021. And indeed, the result of 2021 moved us ever closer in those first months of 2022 to the very edge of the abyss. Let me begin first by the one central dimension of 2021. It should have been a year of healing. It should have been a year of recovery. Instead, it became an incubator of deeper inequality, greater instability, laying down a caustic legacy for years to come. Remember the end of 2022. I'm sure you must recall all leaders around the world telling us, we're going to build back better. Wasn't there one leader who did not say that, who did not promise it to us? Remember their assurances. We have learned what COVID has taught us. The systemic problems, the structural problems, we're going to do that much better now. Remember their promises. We'll be fairer. We will be more sustainable. We will take care of the people. We have understood what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis. We won't do that again. That was what they promised in the early months of 2021. But with 2021 now behind us, we should ask, better for whom? Better by what measures? Better in whose interest? For political leaders, corporate titans have in fact colluded yet again, to put profit, power, and privilege ahead of people, betraying their promises of a fair and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. The rapid rollout of COVID-19 vaccine was supposed to make it so, yet wealthy states and corporations put the narrow economic interest of a few ahead of the human rights of all. Enough vaccines have been produced for everyone on Earth, but by the end of 2021, less than 4% of those living in low-income countries had been fully vaccinated. And what to make of the profit that those guys did? What to make of it? 51 billion for the two big pharmaceutical companies? $51 billion by the end of 2022. Why? Why are we in that situation? Well, clearly because the lessons are not learned, because they don't want to learn the lesson, because wealthy states refuse to share their vaccine supplies. Even today, vaccines sit in freezers throughout Europe and the US. Those states in other world helped big pharma reap record-breaking profit from their refusal to share vaccine formula. Why, should we ask? Economic interest, not caring at all for people. It was an injustice compounded by the decades of neglect and disinvestment in public health care, education, and other social support. The chances of dignity in the face of the pandemic was eroded for millions of people. Why? For economic gains, for greed, for profit, for an illusion into what the kind of economic system we need. And nowhere was this felt more cruelly than here, on this continent, where only so few percent of the continent population, 8 in fact, was fully vaccinated by the end of 2021, where vaccines were delivered unreliably, making it almost impossible to build the needed public trust to distribute them effectively. And what is the outcome? What is the outcome of the lack of investment into building trust, into making the vaccine available? School closures across the continent. In Chad, girls' enrollment in secondary school fell by almost a third. Here, in South Africa, school dropout rate jumped from 230,000 to 750,000. A full generation of kids denied their right, denied their future. Around the continent, and indeed around the world, gender-based violence increased. Sexual and reproductive health was put aside. Evictions continued in the midst of a pandemic. Evictions everywhere. Homelessness. The global failure to build a global response to the pandemic sowed the seeds of greater conflict, greater injustice. The harvest is already on display. Rising poverty everywhere, deeper food insecurity, and further suppression of dissent and protest. All of that was planted in 2021 because of greed, because of selfishness, because of the incapacity of our leaders to imagine a different world. The second message I want to communicate is around conflict. Human suffering in 2021 was further compounded by the utter failure of the global community, particularly of states in position of power, to deal with the multiplication of conflicts. Now, you're going to say there are always conflict. There have been conflict for many years. Yes, but what Amnesty's report is showing is that, and not only us, in fact, is that in 2021 you saw more conflict. You saw older conflict not being solved, and you saw new conflict arriving. From Myanmar to Ethiopia, Israel, Palestine to Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Burkina Faso, Mali. Flights of people, 2021, the largest refugee movement around the world since World War II. That is the symptom of a world in deep, deep trouble. In Burkina Faso, millions fled for safety, subjected to an ongoing humanitarian catastrophe. In Ethiopia, both parties to the conflict engaged in some of the most serious human rights violations we have witnessed in many years. Sexual violence, unlawful killings, as well as denial of access to humanitarian aid, leaving millions in starvation. As the latter half of 2021 unfolded, our TV screens were plastered with images of crowd crushing into Kabul airport, jumping into those planes in desperation. That is the image of 2021. People desperate to escape. What did we do in response? Well, the UN Security Council, frankly, should be more aptly named the UN Insecurity Council. It failed time and time again to act adequately in the face of the military coup in Myanmar, in the face of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, in the face of the persistent conflict in Syria, in the face of Israel and OPT. Its shameful inaction, along with the continued paralysis of other multilateral bodies and the lack of accountability of powerful states over decades, I mean, it's not just a 2021 problem, helped pave the way for Russia's insolence, culminating in its violent invasion of Ukraine in flagrant violation of international law. Even in the face of the gravest existentialist crisis that humanity has ever faced, I'm talking here about the climate crisis, although there are quite a few others, fortunately, but the climate one, still, the world institution and world leaders failed to act to the level commensurate with the challenge. Yes, they went to COP, Glasgow, they met, had good debate, did some little things. But look at the scale of the problem we're confronting and look at their response to it. The gap failed to agree that we should not go above 1.5 degrees temperatures increase. What it means is that billions of people are going to be confronting water shortage, conflict, and death. That is the responsibility of those who are failing to act in measurement with the challenges we are confronting. Third message of 2021. Despite the fact that we have never been at a time where more debates, more discussion is needed in order to reimagine the world, in order to think of a better path. In fact, the world did the opposite in 2021, and that too is a finding of Amnesty International. It is quite extraordinary that in 2021, more than a third of countries introduced new legislations. They were already very bad ones, by the way, from 2020 and before. In 2021, 65 countries, not satisfied enough with the repressive legal framework, they put more on the table. And no one escaped from that, from the north to the south, from the west to the east, in the US, in Europe, in Asia. They all added more legal systems to curtail freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement. And when those draconian laws did not suffice, governments turned to brutal force. Think of what happened a few months back when the Belarusian government went as far as to use a bomber jet to force a civilian plane to land so that it could arrest a single human rights activist. Unbelievable. In Afghanistan, more than 200 media outlets were shut down across the country after the Taliban took over. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong national security law enabled rates of violations of human rights unprecedented since the establishment of the Special Administrative Region. That is 2021. So, what do we do? What do we do when we are confronted with such utter failure, selfishness, greed, complicity, lack of imagination, inability to think a different path, but the one that is bringing us closer to the abyss every day? Frankly, we have no choice but to make our voices heard and to fight every attempt to silence us. We must build together a more tangible and consistent movement for global solidarity. We must rethink and restructure failing international mechanisms, so that they can truly serve peace and security for people. I see that as a role for us all, civil society organization, media, academics. We cannot let that crucial task to government. In 2021, people were threatened, attacked, but they were not silenced. In more than 80 countries, according to Amnesty International report, from Russia to Colombia, activists and journalists stood up, exposed human rights abuses, denounced abuse of power, often at great personal risk. Think of Sudan. Again and again and again, the people of Sudan are going back to the street. Yes, people are trying to steal their democratic revolution, and yet they are back. And yet they are back. Journalists, with the support of Amnesty International, revealed that the spyware Pegasus, produced by an Israeli company, had been deployed against politicians, activists, and journalists in dozens of countries around the world, from Azerbaijan to France, from Rwanda to Saudi Arabia. The good news is, as of this weekend, one of the lawsuits against Amnesty International for having revealed Pegasus has been declared dismissed by the court, the Moroccan lawsuit. Another maybe better news is that last year NGOs, including Amnesty International, successfully lobbied the UN Human Rights Council to recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, to create special mechanisms to investigate climate change and its impact on human rights, to investigate human rights in Afghanistan. So at the normative level, at the court level, at the legal level, we're there, we're fighting back. We have allies in these institutions. Courts in particular have continued to raise to the challenge. In 2021, the largest fines to date have been issued against leading tech companies for breaches of data protection and privacy law, including Amazon, WhatsApp, Grindr. Court also, in many countries where universal jurisdiction exists, have applied the principle to bring war criminals to justice where they could not be brought to justice in their own countries. That is something that we need to hold on to. There are institutions, there are peoples, there are victims, there are survivors, and many, many civil society organizations that are fighting, that are speaking up, and that are preparing a path forward other than the one that governments are doing. They are the proof as well that those institutions must be protected, that we must fight for the independence of our judiciary, that we must fight for the independence of ombudsperson. We need to make sure that we keep those institutions in place so that we are not alone fighting back. It is only people's power that gave us forward-looking momentum in 2021. That, to me, is the saddest, but yet the most hopeful lesson of 2021. We could not count on government. We could not count on the private sectors, private companies, despite their promises. But we could count on the people's power. It is their lead that government must build, not further crush, in 2022. If public policy and private power is to build a path around the abyss, rather than hurtle us further towards it. Practically, what does it mean? Just a couple of examples. State pharmaceutical companies must deliver equal access to COVID-19 vaccine. They must support a full TRIPS waiver, not the kind of deal they're trying to make right now that will be very unsatisfactory, and we can go back to that. Tests and other treatments beside the vaccine must be made available. COVID surplus must be redistributed. 2, another idea for a better future. Wealthy state must ramp up debt relief to facilitate economic recovery. Look at Africa. You know, the financial system, the economic system of the countries of Africa, completely strangled by debt. What kind of future is that for our children, for your children? Reform of the UN, including of its global security system, is long overdue. We need more than just, you know, an overhaul of the system, but we need to begin somewhere. So that begins with the Security Council reform. It begins with getting rid of the use of veto where there are major humanitarian and human rights issues at heart. That must end. In the long run, however, I think it's a complete rethinking of the international multilateral system that is required. And that must involve the energy and the ideas from around the world, not just from a few privileged, including in Africa. African leaders have a key role to play to rethink an international multilateral system that will take people at its heart. But so far they have not been that brave, you know? The bitter fruit of 2021 and of the years before is on display today in Ukraine. Yet, the Ukraine crisis proved that government can act in concert. It confirms that state can move quickly, decisively, to welcome and protect refugees. Look at Europe, you know, completely awful treatment of refugees until the Ukraine crisis, and suddenly we're discovering, oh, we're generous after all. Well, for some people. What it proved, therefore, is just how often and how intentionally states have chosen to do otherwise in the face of so many. How often they have opted to turn their backs on millions of others in flight from other conflict. The point here is that the paths that were chosen in 2021 were paths. They were intentions. They were policies. They were not the product of some forces that could not be stopped. No. You know, when vaccine was not shared, that was a policy decision. When the use of veto was used, that was a policy decision. It's not some obscure, systemic, historical forces. These are decisions made by our leaders. And when they can choose a different path. Most of the times, they don't. The world deserves better leadership than that. A world in crisis needs better leadership than that. A world on the edge of the abyss, only human rights leadership can build the bridge, path the ways, and resource the journeys away from our utter destruction. Thank you very much.
As Agnes mentioned, 2021 was not only the greatest betrayal of our times. To add insult to our injuries, it was also a year where we saw many states redoubling efforts to muzzle critical voices at a time when we needed it most, and often using the smokescreen of the pandemic as an excuse. How did we see this? As Agnes mentioned, at least 67 countries introduced new laws to restrict freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Most used increasingly new technologies to hunt down protesters and dissent. The list is endless. As Agnes mentioned, this includes Cambodia, USA, and Egypt. If we take a look at USA, Senate legislatures at both federal and state level introduced more than 80 new draft bills to restrict freedom of assembly. We also saw an increased securitization of the civic space, especially in response to the growing protests, with government resorting to employing national security laws, criminalizing peaceful assemblies, and resorting to heavy-handed crackdown on protesters, often unnecessary and excessive use of force. We monitored this trend in 85 out of the 154 countries we monitored. And this includes 17 out of the 19 countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Human rights defenders were arbitrarily detained, and again in other 84 countries out of the total we monitored, including some in Africa who had paid the greatest price in their lives. Some governments took dramatic steps to close down or restrict non-governmental organizations and or media outlets, or political opponents for that matter. Take a look at Russia, countries that have systematically deployed laws on foreign agents and undesirable organizations to cripple or ban civil society groups operating in the country. The government designated 14 media outlets in 2021 alone, and over 70 people as foreign agents. As a result, Memorial, one of the country's oldest and most influential human rights organizations, was ordered to shut down in December. Prominent opposition activist Alexei Navalny was sentenced in a politically motivated trial to 32 months imprisonment for violating terms of his probation in relation to yet another Trump charge he faced in 2014. So we see now in our TVs today Russians being detained for braving the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, protesting against this illegal invasion of Ukraine. The same trend we see it in Africa. In over 12 countries, peaceful protesters were killed. Here in the region in Isitoini, the violent dispersal of pro-democracy protests that began in May resulted in 80 days and more than 200 injuries in October. This is on top of the 1,000 protesters who were detained, including about 38 children. In Sudan, as Agnes mentioned, 53 people were shot down by security agents, coming out in protest against the October military coup. The same trend in Chad. We mentioned earlier the national security law for Hong Kong, and let me just give you one example there. During the year, 24 activists were sentenced to between 4 and 16 months in prison for what's called unauthorized assembly. And what were they doing? They were participating in Hong Kong's annual vigil to commemorate the Tiananmen Square crackdown of 1989. The same trend in Afghanistan. This is why we're saying this should be a wake-up call to all of us. If we're not really careful, we'll allow increased powers we've given to the state in such times of crisis to be the new normal. The limited space we have to debate, to dissent, will be closed before our eyes. So we must build on the courage and resilience of peaceful protesters and activists we saw across the world. And it's for that very reason that Amnesty International will be launching this year in a couple of weeks' time our global campaign demanding respect of the right to freedom to protest. And we hope that you will also join us as media professionals and activists in that endeavor. Let me pause here and so that we'll have enough time for conversation. Thank you.
How come 2021 brought us to the Ukraine invasion? So the first thing I will say is that the legacy or the story of Russia's violation of the UN Charter in the early months of 2022 is not only linked to what happened in 2021. There is a much longer history to that violation. Russia has been violating international humanitarian law in Syria for many years. That's the first point. But more broadly than that, for 2 decades, we have seen almost years after years a weakening of the international framework for international peace and security, very much in relationship to the law, to the war on terror. It is not a product of the last 2 years, what's happening today. It is a product of 20 years at least of policy choices, legal choices made by governments, beginning, in fact, with the United States, of undermining the international legal framework, including the UN Charter related to peace and security and the prohibition against the use of force against a peaceful country. So that's the first thing. We are looking at a longer legacy than just 1 year. We are also looking at a country, Russia, having violated the international law with complete impunity in Syria through its well-evidenced bombing of schools, hospitals, and so on, in complete impunity. What is specific, I think, in 2021 that could be seen as ushering a little bit 2022 is the fact that in 2021 we confronted major global crises beginning almost on the first days with Myanmar. And that at every single turn, from Myanmar to Ethiopia, from Israel to Syria, where the conflict continued, there was complete failure on the part of the multilateral institution to respond. You know, that's the lesson of 2021, yet again, but at a bigger level than what we had witnessed in previous years. So 2021 was just, it just made it far more possible for 2022 Russia invasion to happen. That's, it's the slow undermining of the capacity of our multilateral institution to handle peace and security. When it comes to Africa, about 28 states in Africa voted to condemn Russia at the General Assembly resolution on March the 2nd, out of 54. So quite a few of them were quite silenced in their critique. And it is indeed extremely disconcerting and it does not augur well of African leadership when it comes to crises of this nature. We can try to explain why this ambivalence around denouncing Russia by, of course, talking about the West double standard. There is no doubt. There are double standards in the way the Western governments handle crisis. We can try to explain the hesitancy of African states by looking at how Russia, in a previous political incarnation, when it was USSR, supported decolonization, supported the struggle against apartheid. So there may be something like, a sense of loyalty. I take those points. I think they are not strong enough to justify the position taken by those 25 states, including South Africa. Why? Because the crisis in Ukraine right now, the invasion, is an extremely grave invasion. It's not just any kind of violation of international law. It is an aggression under international. It's a violation of the UN Charter of the kind that we saw when the United States invaded Iraq. So it is very grave in terms of escalation of the insecurity of the international system. Second, that aggression has ripple effect across the world. It has ripple effect particularly in Africa. So even if you don't take action for principal reason, you could take action for self-interest reason. The increase in food price, you think that Eastern Africa, for instance, is dependent on wheat from Russia and Ukraine up to 90%. in Somalia. If it is not food, then it is energy. Imagine in the economies that have not recovered from COVID in Africa, now we're going to create food crisis. Now we're creating fuel crisis. You know, that is going to bring those countries on their knees. So if you don't act for principle reason, you should act for self-interest reason. That aggression is a major catastrophe for the entire planet. And then thirdly, I will say, what is disappointing? As I have mentioned earlier in my presentation, we are at a turning point right now, okay? We need a different ways of imagining the future. We need a different way of imagining multilateral system. And we need the energy and the creativity of everyone, not just the usual suspect in the West or in Russia or in China. We need African leaders to be playing a role, to be rethinking, to be reimagining, and to saying, you know, we have a leadership role to play in those big global crises. They're not doing so when they are standing and tiptoeing as they are doing right now. They are absolutely not expressing global leadership. They're doing quite the opposite. They're falling back into the old playbook of, you know, Cold War era and so on and so forth. That's not what we need of African leadership right now. To me, that is the biggest disappointment. We need them. We need them to be at the forefront of forcing the world to rethink the way we're going to work together as a global community. Thank you.
Just to add one more point on the question on Poland and Hungary. One of the clear trends we picked up in our monitoring of the human rights situation last year was how many governments have increasingly used technological tools, including spyware tools, to target human rights defenders, or political opponents, and etc. And a case in point is also Poland, where we found, you know, in collaboration with investigative journalist network that we work with through our Pegasus project, where Hungary, Poland, Azerbaijan, and others use spyware surveillance to target human rights defenders, journalists, and others. Poland in December, for instance, a district prosecutor and member of an association fighting for rule of law was notified by Apple that her phone was tapped and she was under surveillance. So this is a set of issues that we picked up as representing a clear trend that we saw, which governments are widening the gamut of tools they use to repress and stifle dissent, and one of them happens to be a case in point in Poland.
That's why we need a reimagination, we need rethinking, we need all energy, all leadership from Africa to Asia to reimagine a world away from the abyss, to allow us to walk around that abyss. And that is a force that we have in us, in civil society, in the media, in academia. Right now, I don't trust governments to be able to carry us forward around that abyss. So please, grab your power and fight back. Thank you.